Hello, everyone. I believe we are now live. Thank you all for joining us for this special event to celebrate the first ever Global Encryption Day, brought to you by the Global Encryption Coalition. I'm Joseph Lorenzo Hall, Senior Vice President of Strong Internet at the Internet Society, which is a steering committee member of the coalition, along with the Center for Democracy and Technology and Global Partners Digital. I'm delighted to welcome our special guests today, all of whom have unique perspectives on the importance of encryption in our everyday lives and in their fields of work. Edward Snowden is one of the most famous whistleblowers of our modern era. The documents he revealed provide a vital public window into the secret mass surveillance programs and capabilities of the Five Eyes Intelligence Alliance. Edward is going to outline his thoughts on why the pushback from governments around the world to undermine and weaken encryption is a problem for us all. We're also delighted to be joined by Afsaneh Rigot from Article 19's Middle East and North Africa office. She'll be discussing the groundbreaking work being carried out to strengthen the security considerations for dating apps used by LGBTQ+ communities, especially in places like Iran and the wider Middle East. Then we'll hear from Matt Mitchell, founder of Crypto Harlem, which offers free public workshops on privacy, anti-surveillance, and global and digital security for the people of Harlem in New York City. He'll be telling us about why strong encryption allows marginalized communities around the world to protect themselves from the harms of technology and the differences between privacy and secrecy itself. Next, Luisa Brandão, the co-founder of the Institute for Research on Internet and Society, based in Belo Horizonte, Brazil, will be sharing with us her perspective on how end-to-end encryption is being used to keep people safe in uncertain times in Brazil. We're also going to hear why encryption is absolutely crucial for investigative journalism from Lisa Dittmer from Reporters Without Borders. Lisa is going to explain how encryption empowers investigative journalists at a time where governments around the world are trying to silence them. Udbhav Tiwari is public policy advisor at Mozilla and non-resident scholar at Carnegie, India. Udbhav will be outlining progressive alternative regulations for the technology sector and encryption's role specifically in the connectivity of the Asia-Pacific region. Finally, we'll go to businesses who depend on encryption to keep their customers safe. Istvan Lam is co-founder of Tresorit, a cloud storage provider. Istvan will talk about how offering E2E as a service has enabled Tresorit to provide private computation in the cloud. At the end, we're going to have 25 minutes for a question and answer session. So if you'd like to ask one of our panelists a question, please send over your questions to our moderators or use our Q&A chat function to submit your questions. Speaking for myself on behalf of the Internet Society, I'd like to say that I'm so excited to have these people here to talk about this issue. To so many of us that work in the technical community, encryption is like a force of nature, like an atomic force, that if we meddle with, we risk our reality sort of melting around us. But without further ado, I'd like to hand it over to our first speaker, Mr. Edward Snowden.
Thank you very much, Joseph. I'd like to say it's strange for me now, so many years later, to realize that there is a Global Encryption Day. It's a wonderful thing, and I'm very proud to be a part of this, because I remember a time when the former Director of National Intelligence for the entire United States, our highest intelligence official, once spoke at the Aspen Security Conference or some other sort of shadowy room affair, and he was condemning me in front of the crowd and saying, Edward Snowden, he brought forward the adoption of strong encryption by 7 years. And that was supposed to be a terrible thing. And when we look at it from 2021, that really actually feels like an applause line. So it's amazing to me that we have so many speakers from so many different perspectives who are going to say why encryption matters to them, why they need it. My story has been pretty clear about this. Encryption is essential for protecting the sanctity of our communications. But I want to speak a little bit more personally to, I know we have some journalists with us in the room. And just think about the bigger picture. Why any of this matters? Why any of us care? Some of you are probably investigative journalists. And I want you to ask yourself, what would happen if the subjects of your investigations could read your drafts before they're published, right? And they're still in the pipeline. What about before they were edited, before you even knew what you were sure of in the story? What's true, what's false, where it's going? What would happen if they knew what you knew and what you didn't know? What if they knew who you reached out to? What if they knew who was willing to talk to you on or off the record about the story? And so I think, imagine, too, by some miracle in this world, what everything looks like the day after that story goes to print. It probably feels good. You're like, great, despite all of the obstacles, despite all of the hurdles, somehow I got something that was worthy enough for people to read, some new true fact. But then you realize that because they know so much about how the story was formed, they probably also know a great deal about you. And that means they know how to make their own story within this story cycle, perhaps about you, right? This changing of the subject is something that I'm extremely familiar with, because this is what happened in 2013. I came forward and showed something terrible was happening within the US domestic context. A system of global mass surveillance had been constructed in secret that was in violation of the law and very likely the Constitution of the United States. And now, fortunately, we know that wasn't just my own political instinct. That's been affirmed by appeals courts in the United States. So this is the way it is. The government, in secret, worked in a vast real-world conspiracy to break the law, to entitle themselves to more information about all of us, the vast majority of which have never been suspected of any crime and never will be. And so a lot of people go, well, privacy and security, they create this false choice. When we take up this example of your life, your story, your communications, your work, it feels like a privacy problem. And I think we need to analyze that. Is this a privacy problem? Is it about privacy? Or is it about power? And this is what people miss on the encryption issue and why it's so important. Privacy is power. It was meant to be the individual's power, right? It was meant to protect us, to shelter us from the institutional behemoths that sort of march through the cities of our day, whether it's the modern time or the time before. It was an insulating layer that allowed those of us who wield very little power in society, because we are individuals, to think and act and associate freely, to go about our lives without worrying about where these feet are falling from these giant beasts of not just state, but corporate power, because they could crush us at any given time. So we are supposed to know everything about them. They're supposed to be great, vast, bright lights on the public horizon. And we are ships at sea where we choose whether to turn our lights on or our lights off to protect ourselves, be identified by lighthouses, or to be left alone and be by ourselves. But this idea that privacy is power is important, because bear in mind that the words that are constantly ringing in our ears today is that privacy is dead. The privacy problem that we face is one of intermediation. There is an institution today, really in the middle of everything that you do. They give you your news, even if you write some of it, right? They book your hotels, they authorize the gas in your tank, they stock the specific groceries that you purchase, and they associate that with the payment method that you use. They know you were in that store at that time because you're the only card out there that uses these things. Even if you use cash, eventually they can correlate that behavior, because your behavior is unique, just like your movements are unique, just like the place that you sleep at night is unique. You can't de-anonymize you can't anonymize human activity at scale. These intermediaries also convey our most intimate messages. We give them to these services or these applications that we trust then to give them to the internet service providers that we trust then to give them to the distant ends of the communication that we're trying to communicate with. And I mean, it goes all the way down the stack to the lowest level. These intermediaries even ring the alarm that woke you up this morning because they push the network time notifications to the phone that tells it, what time of day it is. So from sunrise to sunset, there are 10,000 intermediaries exploiting their positions of privilege in intermediating our daily lives, our simple affairs. And the law today, such as it is, has little will, and I would argue even less interest in protecting us from this exploitation. This is the central problem. And, some of you may find it a little bit unseemly to say that, but I suspect that you do, of course, privately, recognize that so long as control of the law is held by, a few mandarins in the legislative system, and the people who control those mandarins, members of the ownership class and the security state that entrenches them, that keeps that system stable, so long as they perceive themselves to profit from this status quo, change which is necessary must come from below. So this is a long way of saying, without saying it, because I want to leave it to other panelists, that the encryption debate, such as it is, such as we've heard, is in fact over. There's not a question of do we need more, do we need less, do we need backdoors? We have tried that. It has failed. We need more encryption. We need pervasive encryption because it is the only means of providing even a little bit of privacy. And it's not enough. It does not protect us entirely. It does not protect our activities such as they are observed in mass at scale. But it is a basic fundamental protection that if pierced or braided in the slightest way fails comprehensively. Let me close just with the anecdote here because some people are going, oh, well, they're still talking about encryption. Why I am so confident saying that it has failed is, for those of you who missed it, it's a story that's been running on since 2015 now, but was just written about by Bloomberg in just the last months. The U.S. National Security Agency created a backdoor in a very particular random number generator. It's called dual elliptic curve deterministic random bit generator, I think. Dual EC DRBG. That nobody trusted from the time it was standardized, but somehow it squeaked through the US standardization process. And then the US government began requiring it of major commercial providers such as Juniper, who makes a number of the routers that connect the internet. If you wanted to sell to the military, you needed to show you had support for this protocol. It was quite unusual. Nobody really wanted to use it, but somehow they had a plan for this. Well, at some point, we believe, I think in 2015, Juniper was hacked. And this secret NSA backdoor that had a special key in it that allowed encrypted communications that were encrypted using this algorithm by these devices could be read, but only by the people who had this key, which meant only the NSA was supposed to read it. This is so-called nobody but us encryption. It is decryption. It is the gold standard of surveillance that everybody aspires to, and what they claim in newer modern versions they would use. They say it's secure. There's no way around it because only they have the key. Well, Juniper got hacked. We believe Chinese found this code and they replaced it. They didn't turn it off. They didn't expose it. They simply pulled the NSA's key out and inserted a Chinese key of their own. And then the next day, everybody's communications that were supposed to be only readable by the NSA, who for whatever reason we were supposed to trust, were now being read by the Chinese. There is no way to safely decrypt communications on what they consider or call an exceptional access basis. What we need is inabrogable protections, things that no one can violate, because that is the only way to ensure we're all protected, we're all safe, and our lives, our private communications stay that way. With that, I've said too much. Let's go to the other panelists. Thanks so much.
Thank you, sir. Immediately moving on to Afsaneh Rigot of Article 19. Afsaneh.
Hi, everyone. It's such an honor to be here. And Salam Snowden. I just wanted to start off with a personal note grounding this in personal experiences. I myself couldn't be here at this press conference if it wasn't for the use of secure technology and privacy tools. For many like me who want to continue to work or research or exist safely online using encrypted technologies becomes a vital part of our toolbox to continue doing this work. So it's kind of interesting to see the pretense where there are certain governments or companies who, on the face of it, champion work like ours, are challenging the tools I and others use to conduct it. So the question for me often becomes, who are they protecting? This is a question that comes to my mind when I do my research too. It's important to note that the communities I'm from and I work with, predominantly queer communities in the Middle East and North Africa, the use of secure modes of communication away from interception or just the feeling of being intercepted is vital to ensure people stay connected, for community, for activism, for love, for basic parts of existence, especially in contexts where there are so many risks. Encryption is the baseline for safety here. It's the core base where we build other safety and security measures in our advocacy and work. And that base is being eroded. So again, who are they protecting? I don't know. But in my time researching and outlining how governments in the Middle East and North Africa weaponize technology to target queer folks in the region and to try and hold the companies being used by them, so the tools and technologies being used by them to account to provide better privacy or safer tools for individuals, I'm often told that the core base that is encryption is being pushed back against. So it's hard to even bring in further fundamental safety and security measures. This is often because, for example, European or US law enforcement say they have no other tools to tackle certain crimes if things are being encrypted. This is a fallacy. Research I do and many others have done show that law enforcement rely mainly and heavily on traditional and manual methods of policing to do a lot of the things they're doing, and often don't even have the tools to cipher through the amount of data they're trying to access. So these sort of fake and false conflations really need to be challenged, especially at the time right now where we're seeing these challenges to things like encryption. Also, as many folks point out and talk about, it's so little data to suggest that this erosion of privacy measures leads to any further national security frames that they're invoking. In fact, there's enough to suggest the actual opposite. So what I want to say, and I want to land on, is that if you're pushing back against the baseline, it means our communities can't get the more and other vital security measures that we're trying to get through because of these straw man arguments. So again, I want to say, who are they protecting? And how is it not clear that this further erosion of encryption is about power rather than protection? I'm just going to end it there, but really grateful to be here and looking forward to the rest of the conversation.
Thank you so much, Afsaneh. I don't believe Matt Mitchell was able to join us, so unless I see him pop up, I'm going to move right on to Louisa Brandau of IRIS.
Thank you, Joe. It's a pleasure to be here. As we have already heard today, encryption is key to our data and communication safety. It enables integrity, accuracy, and ultimately trust. But it also has a more sensitive dimension. As Afsaneh just said, it is a baseline, and sometimes it is also the lifeline. For example, here in Brazil, there are services to help women against domestic violence through encrypted channel. And then I ask you, how could they work if a possible perpetrator of domestic violence has the chance to access them? How could women reach out for help if they did not have the safeguards that encryption offers? This is an example, a very sensitive one, on how important and strong end-to-end encryption is. In this context, weakening it is even more serious. And we have seen these going dark narratives, for example, from Bolsonaro's government agenda and threats to ban strong encryption. And they entail serious consequences for all of us. Like in India, traceability has been brought up in recent debates, and one mandatory traceability rule for online messages apps has already been approved by the Senate. It worries us a lot because now it is being discussed in the Chamber of Representatives, and we are trying to fight back against this traceability. Because how does, for example, the helpline against domestic violence work being traceable? And being traceable because the law rules so. It does not work. So what I believe these proposals mean is that they compromise the safety of all of us, as Mr. Snowden already said, especially in our context with a government that openly keeps records of its opponents and tracks opponents, bloggers, journalists, activists. And these proposals also undermine this trust I talked about in my first remarks. And this trust is the only thing that allows us to live a little bit safer and is enabled just by the use of full and spread end-to-end encryption, strong encryption. I will end here and look forward for our debate. Thank you very much for this opportunity.
Thank you so much, Louisa. Moving right along, we move to Lisa Dittmer of, I can't say it in French, but Reporters Without Borders.
Works out fine. Thank you very much. And thank you very much for the opportunity to speak to you today about the importance of encrypted communications to investigative journalists worldwide, but also to press freedom at large. In order to uncover wrongdoing and to hold the powerful to account, journalists must be able to make a promise to those who talk to them, a guarantee to keep their exchanges confidential. Informants' livelihoods, even their personal safety, can depend on it. In the age of digital communications, the basis of this guarantee is encryption. Encrypted messenger services, emails, secure Dropboxes allow sources to contact media confidentially and, where needed, also anonymously. The Panama Papers happened because an anonymous source was able to contact a journalist of Süddeutsche Zeitung through encrypted chat and pass on documents and stay anonymous, in fact, up to present day. Edward Snowden's case, of course, his revelations depended on encrypted messages. And in fact, all major investigative stories of the past decade were enabled by encrypted communication channels. The safest way to communicate with sources might still be in a place far away from all digital technology, but that's hardly a feasible way forward in a modern world in which it often takes hundreds of journalists to sift through, terabytes of documents. So worldwide, journalists themselves are facing more and more digital threats to their work and their safety. Our work at Reporters Without Borders, defending press freedom and supporting journalists in danger, is ever more often connected to shrinking digital spaces, to online censorship and threats and surveillance. Whether it be the current crisis in Afghanistan, where we have to communicate and make sure that our communications with threatened journalists don't, in fact, put them in even graver danger, or whether it is reporters in Russia, Azerbaijan, Morocco, and so many other states who make headlines when they are incarcerated, when they are judicially harassed, but in most cases, in fact, the repression starts much earlier and much less visibly with state surveillance. The Pegasus project recently shed light on the massive scale of spyware abuse against human rights defenders and journalists. Against this most aggressive of weapons, there's very little one can do to protect oneself. But rather than throw our hands in the air and give up, this revelation must be a global call to action. For governments to take action and regulate the trade in digital technologies such as Pegasus, for us to invest in our own digital security wherever possible. We at RSF Germany offer a fellowship focused on digital security trainings for journalists. And what we often learn is that far more newsrooms and journalists worldwide should invest in training and learning about these things and implementing good practices. But all of these efforts will only pay off if more companies invest in privacy by design, and more importantly still, if governments commit to upholding and promoting the right to encryption. Over the past years, even democratic states have extended police and intelligence services powers to access and monitor digital communications rather than scale back surveillance. Further proposals for backdoors for proactive and automatic scans of our content are currently under debate. All of these options would fundamentally weaken public trust in the confidentiality of communications. Potential whistleblowers will shy away from reaching out, and really important stories will go untold. Authoritarian governments will build on these ideas to pursue dissenters even more aggressively and at greater scale, and journalists will be driven to self-censor. So those who uphold press freedom must also commit to the right to encryption. Digital rights save lives. They protect the freedom to dissent, to organize, to stand up for human rights. So do not put this freedom at risk. Thank you very much.
Powerful, powerful perspective and words. Moving right along, going to someone who is in the policy front lines in India, Udbhav Tiwari from Mozilla.
Thank you so much, Joe. Over the course of the next couple of minutes, I'll mostly be talking about how encryption is now such an integral part of the lives of hundreds of millions of users on the internet in the Asia-Pacific region, but also how the safety and security that they enjoy is under grave threat. Now, secure encryption is something that's very much a very integral part of the lives of users across the world, but also specifically in the Asia-Pacific region. Thanks to the percentage of the population on the internet that exists here in the Asia-Pacific region, it is simple and easy to use encryption that's now become such an integral part of their daily lives that most of us aren't even aware of the fact that it exists. If one were to take some very simple examples like the deployment of HTTPS via nonprofits such as Let's Encrypt, where over 80% of the internet is now encrypted between service providers and users on their browsers, or technologies like DNS over HTTPS, which are key to protecting one of the last unencrypted pillars of the modern internet. And finally, to even end-to-end encryption, where apps like Signal, but also messaging services from all major providers that are popular in the region, which have hundreds of millions of users between them, are reliably able to guarantee to their users that the communications that they are conducting technically are secure from interference from all malicious actors, whether they be illegal actors who are carrying out illegal activities or even governments who are carrying out illegal surveillance. However, governments in the region, which were always uncomfortable with the idea of strong encryption, are now getting particularly scared by its almost ubiquitous existence, where we are now seeing laws rather than the previous iterations of the so-called crypto wars, where there were governments who were trying to directly regulate or limit the strength of encryption, are coming up with more creative laws that create indirect ways of essentially making it redundant. One of the most interesting ways in which we've seen this happen around the world, and arguably very concerning, is traceability. India is now arguably the first country in the world that has a law that is in force that requires the traceability of encrypted content, where the originators of messages need to be made available to the government or law enforcement agencies upon request. Apart from the usual concerns around surveillance, this move forces platforms to collect even more information about users in one of the few areas where the standard of protection of communication that users have enjoyed over the last decade odd has actually gone up. We've also seen laws like the TOLA law in Australia, which are essentially technical access laws. These laws where essentially allow the government to command service providers to introduce systemic vulnerabilities in to systems in order to compromise the protection that they may offer the users who utilize those services. Now, while there is an argument to be made that these are targeted attempts at weakening encryption, as we've seen from the many examples so far in this conversation, whenever one creates a weakness for a single user, they are compromising the system as a whole. And it's very difficult to be able to meaningfully control the impact that these systemic vulnerabilities can have on how the technology is utilized and deployed around the world. Because of some of these trends, it's very vital that encryption be defended all around the world. Its benefits are quite clear and tangible. If one would like to imagine a world without encryption, in the direction that democracies, both in this region but also elsewhere, have taken, we've already seen the consequences of governments and malicious actors gaining access to the devices of users, arguably one of the safest places where they can store some of the most private information about their lives. Imagining a world where all of this data could be flowing through the internet and the ether that the internet is, with the ability for it to be compromised and intercepted by malicious actors and intelligence agencies alike, is a very scary world. And that's the world that we need to push back against. I believe that encryption should be simple, easy, pervasive, and inviolable, where there are no backdoors, where weaknesses for targeted use simply do not exist, allowing the billions of users on the internet to communicate with each other and utilize the services that they do in as safe and as secure a manner as possible. Thank you.
Well said. If I could be 1/10 as lucid as Udbhav, I would be a better man for it. Moving to Matt Mitchell from Crypto Harlem. It sounds like Matt is on his third laptop, so I wanted to give him a little breathing room before we threw him right into the mix. But Matt, good to see you.
Thank you. Thank you. It's good to be here. Sorry for the technical problems. Let me jump right in and talk about encryption from a perspective of marginalized communities around the world. Marginalized communities like Black folks in Harlem in the United States are under increased level of surveillance, and it's layers of surveillance from corporate surveillance, government surveillance, and as well as law enforcement surveillance that leads to basically living in a dystopian future, right? Encryption allows for freedom. Encryption allows for liberty, and encryption allows folks to protect themselves. And that's something that we try to educate everyone on. Oftentimes, the worst examples of when technology goes wrong and when it impacts people, technology becomes something that happens to you. Those stories are the stories of marginalized people. And, you know, that's Black, Indigenous, people of color, trans, queer folks, sex workers, like anyone who are pushed to the margins of our societies. Oftentimes, they're cast under a suspicious lens, and their very identities are criminalized. Instead of investigating, like, you know, what are you messaging or how are you messaging? Let's talk about it. Let's figure out things. There's just an idea of grabbing up the messages and dragnet surveillance. And we see this in the United States through things like geofence warrants, where during, let's say, last year's year of racial reckoning with the George Floyd protests and the movement for Black Lives, what we've seen is huge amounts of data being collected around protest, and messaging data, location data, any phone that was in a particular latitude or longitude. And encryption allows people to defend themselves from these things. The messages that you have will be encrypted, and therefore they're not going to be under this high level of unnecessary over-policing and scrutiny. Oftentimes, a public safety argument is used to target these communities. We also have examples of other technologies like bias in algorithms and AI. On the data that's used to train the corpus, large amounts of historic data that's used to train these models are often faulty and kind of like garbage in, garbage out, and they lead to a high scrutiny, technological scrutiny of folks, right? We have examples of young people when what we call digital stop and frisk, where they'll be stopped and their phones will be taken from them, their messages will be examined. Whatever they post on social media will, you know, be criminalized and used against them. You know, there's the case of Jelani Henry in New York City, in Harlem, where I'm from. And, you know, with Jelani, he spent 14 months in prison in Rikers, a prison so bad that we're trying to close it down. And it's an international human rights defender saying this place needs to close. All because of this kind of data, right? Like electronic evidence of who was in your contacts in your phone, who liked a post or who, replied on a post, creates this kind of 6 degrees of suspicion, really, right? And after 14 months, they opened up Jelani's prison cell, and no apology, just kind of go home. And he's been like really and dealing with that. And oftentimes the story doesn't end with you going home if you, under the pressures or conditions, sign something you shouldn't, or say that you were involved in a crime that you were not. Luckily for him, and that's not a rare story. It's a story I hear from the West Coast to the East Coast of the United States, right? So that we have digital stop and frisk, we have the suspicious gaze, we have issues with messaging, and then for activists and organizers, whether you're in Portland or New York City, right, whether you're in the Oakland area or others in Detroit, activists are finding that they have the same issues. So just to wrap, I just want to say that encryption allows all people to be able to have doors and curtains and choose who they let in and how they let in and who they share their most intimate thoughts and feelings with. And some people are already seen as suspicious persons based on their very identities and how they choose to exist in this world. And encryption protects them more than anyone else. It really helps the most vulnerable in our societies, no matter where you are on this globe. And that's the beauty of it.
Thank you, Matt. So from everyone to marginalized groups to journalists, we're now moving with the closing remark from Istvan Lam, who represents businesses who often want to protect the data in the best way they can. Istvan.
Thank you, Joe. My background, I'm a cryptography engineer, and I'm designing and encrypted systems in the last 12 years. And when it comes to talking about weakening encryption, we cannot do this. It's everywhere. I mean, it's the encryption and cryptography more in general. It's a bedrock of our modern society. It's not just about end-to-end encrypted chats, end-to-end encrypted systems. It is the bedrock of our digital world. But beyond our digital world, nowadays, I mean, your cars are full of different stuff. Everything and everywhere you run into encryption, and putting holes into this complex system, putting holes into this bedrock, it's a bad idea. And as Edward said, with the Juniper case, with weakening the random generator, that was the idea, was okay, that one guy can get access. No, you cannot foresee what things can go wrong if you're weakening this bedrock under or economy. And you should not underestimate the encryption. It's end-to-end encryption is just one part. But if you are weakening end-to-end encryption, you are weakening it's everywhere. And me as an engineer, I really see this as like it's a bad idea. It's simply really bad. And the other thing about businesses, I mean, encryption protects businesses, and not just from its own, but it helps to protect the consumers they serve. It helps to protect the economy they serve, and it's an obligation for businesses to do that. It's a regulatory obligation to use encryption, and less and less. And if we are weakening it, businesses cannot operate, or they will have harder time to meet the requirements. And when it comes to customer data, employee data, healthcare data, or just simple IP and protecting the IP, that is also coming back. How it's endangered with that. What I think. If we are weakening the encryption, we were talking about a lot with one part of the society. But what we need to understand, it's if we're weakening the encryption, it will be impacted every part of the society, because this will weaken the trust in the digital world. And if it's weakened, then our economy will be weakened, because currently our economy is going more and more digital. We are putting more and more data. We're living our life more and more digital. And if we are weakening encryption, it's gonna be the people will put less and less there, and will try to find other ways around that. I don't believe that's a good way, and I don't believe it's a viable way, as the Juniper case showed that that if you weaken for one person, you're weakening, or you create a backdoor for one person, you are creating a backdoor for someone else as well. You may not want. And it's for me. I mean, it's when it comes to talking about Global Encryption Day, as an engineer, as someone who wanted to do encryption and wanted to become a cryptography engineer all my life, it's a great thing that at least we're recognizing the importance and the importance of this shadow work of cryptography for our society, for our economy. And if we are getting back, taking it back, then we may not serve, and we will be surprised how our life could be impacted with a less strong background. Thank you. Back to you, Joe.
Wonderful. What a amazing quilt of encryption, from the big picture to the smaller individual picture. We'll now have time for Q&A. There's a Q&A function for those of you attending that you can submit questions. Some of you have already, and we've noted those in a separate document I'll be looking at. But please feel free as we talk to add questions to that, and I'll note people's name that asked the question, and if you're in the audience, I'll give you a moment to actually ask yourself. Take your video and turn your video on and put your audio on. You don't have to do that if you don't want to. I'm happy to ask the questions on my own, so I'll wait a few seconds after each one, and then I'll just ask the question. I'm going to start with some questions that they're just basic. I'm wondering where the panelists think the biggest threats to encryptions are coming from. Are they state? Are they organized crime, cybercrime, state-sponsored crime in some cases? Do we feel that industry is doing enough? Or are there elements of industry that could be a threat themselves? Someone give me a nod who might want to take a Edward, please.
Let me start with it, just because something we've talked all about encryption, but for those of us who are joining us from YouTube or whatever, we haven't really talked about what it actually is, why it exists. If you think about the internet, how it works, like you guys might be sitting on a bus looking at your phone. How does this stream get to you? Where does it come from? Physically, like where does this video exist? Well, this video is generated at all of these devices for all of these speakers around the world. It then goes to a centralized service, Zoom, unfortunately. And each of these connections, right, anybody who is in the middle of those, if they were being sent in the way they originally were, the easiest way, would be readable. Anybody could intercept this video, just as anybody could intercept your instant messages or your emails, who's just sitting on the same coffee shop network as you and running a sniffer. You used to be able to do this. I've done it myself personally. The technology is not advanced. If unencrypted communications, meaning electronically naked or native communications, we're just everywhere, anybody can see them. Encryption is simply a way of putting clothes on communications so they're not walking around naked, right? It is a form of electronic armoring that allows your signal to get from point A to point B, and the only people who can read them are the ones who hold the keys. Now, what this means is in everyday life, you are all using encryption. There is no one in this call listening to this right now who's not using encryption, because this call is encrypted, right? You're only encrypted between your device and Zoom, right? Zoom has the keys to watch all of us, unfortunately, in a lot of cases. But this is a standard and the problem for centralized services. This is what we saw back in 2013. All of these companies had amassed these great repositories of information about us, all of your Facebook messages, everything you've ever typed in that Google search box, anything you've ever bought on Amazon, right? Every story that you've read at that newspaper site because you're logged in or whatever, you have a cookie or you're going from a traditional IP address. And they could then turn this over. This is a way and remains a way to get around encryption, because the encryption is generally protecting the communication as it's in transit across the internet. Encryption can also be used to protect data at rest. For example, think about you put a password on your phone, you turn it off, then you leave it at the bus station, somebody picks it up. Well, nowadays, they're never getting into that data on that phone. For most people, the police can try to do very special ways to try to get around the encryption, to try to, for example, if you use a weak PIN code, enumerate all the potential PIN combinations on that to ask the phone to let them in. But strictly breaking encryption is no longer commonly feasible. This is why it's so powerful. This is why you've seen it take over the world. Every company and every person, every technologist who's developing something realizes now encryption is a basic protection that allows you to move data more safely. And when you want to put data to bed at night on your phone or something like that, you put a little encrypted blanket over it and it will sleep safe, right? Now, who's responsible for the threats to encryption? There are a lot of people who don't want information to be unreadable to them. And this is where we see governments and companies come into play. The same companies that have worked so hard to spread encryption over the years are now beginning to fear the next step, which is, some of our speakers have mentioned, end-to-end encryption. There was this question about who holds the keys, right? Those are the only people who can read an encrypted communication. Those are the only people who can unlock it, right? In end-to-end encrypted communications, the only people who have those keys are the intended recipient and the sort of originating sender, right? You picking up the phone, you calling your friend, and only your friend can read that call, even if it is routed through another service provider, through an internet service provider, through the coffee shop, it's sitting on Facebook's server, whatever. They don't have the key. But groups like Facebook want to have as much information as possible. So now they're limiting where they'll use end-to-end encryption. They'll say, for things that we don't want to have a business liability for, we'll adopt end-to-end encryption. We don't want to know what's in your private messages that are, super on the down low or whatever, because honestly, Facebook doesn't want to face more legal demands for account requests for low-level stuff like, you buy weed on Facebook or Instagram or something like that. That is just annoying to their business. They're not socially minded. They don't care. They care about their interests. Now, the state, on the other hand, doesn't want anybody to have any privacy anywhere from them. They say, we won't use it commonly. We won't use it every day. We won't use it for everyone. But we want the exceptional access capability, where if we so choose, we can read any communication anywhere at any time. This was the dream they were pursuing in that Juniper case originally, where they had found an encryption scheme. They developed their own encryption scheme that was weak against them. They had then leaned on these companies to force them to integrate it into their products. And then their hope was that some people would use these things and then they would be able to look into it. That's what they want to do now in the EU, in the US, in Australia, in Russia, in China. Every major state is trying to develop means and methods for requiring weak encryption systems. They say strong encryption, but backdoored encryption systems, exceptional access systems, to be built into all the products that we use. So when they want, they have special keys or can gain access to special keys that allow them to read our stuff. So the big threat is coming. You want to think about the motive there. It's for people who want to retain access to information that, frankly, they should not have. If we talk about the states and state interests, they can still get around encryption, if you will, even the best, most perfect, unbreakable encryption through hacking. And they do, because if they've hacked your device, right, those keys we talked about, they simply steal your key. And then it doesn't matter how well encrypted it is. They have the key, they can read it just like you can.
So thanks. I'm going to, if anyone wants to do more answers to that, do it in a minute. But what I'm going to do is ask Renata Aquino Ribeiro from TechMasters Brazil if they would want to ask their question in real time. I'll wait a few seconds. If not, I'll ask it. Seeing no Renata, I'm going to ask this. I think this is oriented at Louisa. Oh, wait, Renata, go for it. Give it a moment, everyone.
You're
Hi. Hi, thank you for this panel. I'm Renata Aquino Ribeiro from TechMasters Brazil. And my first question, just in case, I did two questions, just in case I don't get to ask them both, I'm going to try to combine them. My first question is, Snowden said about us needing tools that no one can violate. And reminding us from the scenario in 2013 and today, in the case of Brazil specifically, we have very different governments. So how can we create these tools when we have a change in governments that could not support that? And how do we defend ourselves from those governments that want to change, want to end the laws? And we are living, my second question now, in a post-pandemic crisis. So we have the idea of vaccine passports and pre-existing health conditions being documented and shared widely. Matt reminded us about the George Floyd protests and the Black Lives Matter movement. This is pretty worrying that we are moving to an era of privacy, that privacy is even more violating our biological or humane aspects of our lives. So how do we deal with that? So thank you for your answers. My question would be to Snowden, Matt, and all. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I'll try to go quick because I know we probably have more questions. The issue with the change of government and their changing positions on encryption policy is precisely why encryption should not be a question for governments to regulate. We need to structure encryption technology in such a way that it's happening, particularly because it's a global system, right? Nobody really cares what encryption laws are in state A or state B in a global internet. The network will pass communications regardless, so long as they conform to protocol. And this is the way it should be. What we want is we want for there to be enough open, free, and developed states that recognize the value of free communications and protected, safe communications, that they allow the development of standards of communication that are strongly encrypted and, as we said, inviolable. They then bake these into the products and services that everybody in the world uses. Then, if the government of Brazil or anywhere else decides they want to start spying on everyone, they have a difficult choice because they can now no longer use global standard products. What they have to do is they have to cut themselves out of the global economy in order to gain or engage in these kind of policies, which is a choice, but it's a much more difficult one to do. If you have to replace all of the equipment in the racks in every data center in Brazil, every phone handset, every software package, every time the government changes, they won't do that because they won't be finished by the time the government changes again. And so I think we need to recognize the scale of the effort and the inertia is important. So again, encryption really should be a question separate to government. It's not really, it shouldn't be contingent on government whims and wants. It's not a political question, it's a public safety question. And this is different than state security. Public safety is very different from state security. And the public safety is served by creating strong, safe communications for everyone everywhere. In the context of the pandemic, it's really the same thing. I think it's just opportunism. Like with September 11th and terrorist attacks domestically in every country, when the government has a crisis, they will try to exploit that crisis as a lever in order to gain access to policy preferences that they may have held for a long time, but had not been able to realize in more stable times. When we have emergencies, when we have exigent circumstances, then you see policymakers getting creative and saying, we need this new policy or we need this new power to respond to this new threat. Again, we need to recognize that encryption is a basic fabric that undergirds all communications, all economy, all trade, and that has to be stable and reliable in a certain way, inflexible to official demands. Because if we create exceptional capabilities, whether it's for the United States, whether it's for the EU, whether it's for Brazil, whether it's for anybody, if you poke a hole for one person, anybody else can find it.
That's really great. We have very little time. I think what I want to do is go to each of the panelists, and give you a moment to wrap up either threats, what we could do with governments. There's some great questions about middle ground between public interest and authorities needs to investigate and stuff like that. I'll go with how I see it. I'll go Lisa, Matt, Louisa, Afsaneh, Istvan, and then a final word from Edward. Lisa.
I'll maybe just connect to what was just said, because I think it's such an interesting reframing that's happening, where democratic governments in particular are saying, trust us, we're the good guys. When did we ever get to the point of such an ahistorical understanding of politics to say, trust us, we're the good guys? There will always be the not so good guys waiting, but more importantly, Ed already explained, we live in an internet connected world. Anything that happens in the smallest part, in the smallest jurisdiction, has consequences everywhere. We've seen that with platform regulation, probably one of our worst exports from Germany in recent years, where authoritarian governments know very well how to take something that was maybe thought through, maybe even thought out from a motive that is laudable, but is deeply usable for authoritarian states, that is dangerous to people everywhere. And so, no, don't trust. Let's take back this understanding of, no, fundamentally, most humans deserve our trust. That is the important bit. But first of all, governments, dear governments, trust us, that we have a right to encryption, we have a right to confidentiality, we have a right to our own private thoughts, and this matters, and it will matter in coming years. And yeah, don't allow this reframing to be successful. And I'll pass on with that.
Just a note, we're going to go about 5 minutes over, so feel free to take some deep breaths while you speak. I was having problems with that, but Matt.
Thank you so much, Joseph, and what a powerful statement from Lisa. Kind of piggybacking on what Edward said and Hanada's original question, the pandemic has shown us that we're all vulnerable, we're all human beings, but we're also all connected. And regardless of passport, we're earthlings, we're all on this planet together, and we have a responsibility to look out for each other. Sorry for the New York City soundtrack. And at the end of the day, encryption is wearing a mask, it's washing your hands, it's asking how your neighbor's doing, it's taking personal responsibility, and that can't be taken away from you. You know, like what we've seen with the Black Lives Matter movement and the Move for Black Lives is sometimes laws get it wrong. Sometimes bad things happen. And it's for us to, do what we can to say, look, I'm looking out for myself, for my neighbor, for my people, for my community, for my country. And encryption allows you to do that. Regardless of, what's going on, governments come, governments go, things become repressive, things become more free. But we, the people in the mirror, we're the ones in charge of letting misinformation confuse us and equate encryption with bad things, when encryption is the thing that will liberate and free all of us and keep us free for generations to come. So at the end of the day, like, we have a responsibility on Global Encryption Day to install an encrypted app, use an encrypted tool, read more about the positive things that come from encryption, realize that we're helping not only ourselves, but the most vulnerable to our left and right. And if things go wrong, which you can never plan for, encryption is that solve. It's that safety. It is a connection to your dignity and humanity. It allows you to, like Edward says, like wear clothing. It allows you to, like Lisa says, like have an intimate thought and share it with someone who you choose. Without encryption, we lose our very humanity.
Encryption is for the earthlings. All right, Louisa.
Wow, such powerful words. And I couldn't agree more with Matt and Lisa that we must have the right to encryption and to privacy, and we must protect ourselves. Here in Brazil, we are fighting against these attempts through weakening encryption, and we will for sure use this Global Encryption Day and all this network to make a point and for strong encryption, because we want this guarantee. Right now in the Supreme Court, we have the chance in 2 cases that are being analyzed to have encryption linked to the fundamental right of privacy. Just yesterday, we got a personal data protection as a fundamental right in our constitution, and it is a big win. But we need to keep going in this way to have the statement that encryption is also our right, and it doesn't matter what government, how repressive or free, it's our right to privacy, and it's our right to live at the end of the day. So thank you very much, and we see each other in this amazing Global Encryption Day.
I've got powerful goosebumps. Afsaneh.
Thank you, everyone. I'm not sure what else there is to add to this, but this has been an awesome panel and a privilege to be a part of it. But I think one thing I wanted to add to what everyone's saying is that the current sort of political mental gymnastics being played around conflating different issues of terrorism, even I'm just in the UK, cancel culture, and removing the right to encryption are really worrying concepts. And I think we need to be doing a lot more to unravel these misconceptions. And there's so much information, research, and data to unravel what's being pushed out to kind of challenge the different frameworks being shown to us. In my context, in the countries I work with and the sort of research I do, law enforcement uses every single method available to them to gather this data. And it's data to try and criminalize identity. So data to try and gather and criminalize folks being queer. And as you can imagine, identity is a very fragile and intimate concept to try and conjure in a prosecution context. In some of these situations, they don't need to have some sophisticated hacking materials, but if they have those tools, if these like holes are poked and they have those tools, it's quite devastating to try and imagine the amount of information that gets gathered on that, like the amount they already have access to. And hopefully you'll see with the reports coming out soon, it's already quite damning, let alone if they have further access to tools and sort of backdoors and whatnot to gather this sort of information on folks and to do this sort of prosecution or surveillance or tracking that's already been done in so many different methods. I think one point I want to land on is for companies, especially in governments too, that encryption is where we start. Folks like me, we're asking for more. We're asking for a lot more. So if this is the place where having a war with people, this is quite worrying because this is where we start. This is not where we're ending. So I'm just going to end on that note and thank all the panelists here today and the wonderful event that happened. Thank you so much.
That's profound. Encryption is table stakes for everything else. Udbhav.
Thanks, Joe. I think the only thing I'd like to add is that the one thing that's become quite clear to me through the course of this conversation and a lot of the work that we've done over the last couple of years is the importance of solidarity when it comes to encryption. If one were to just like wind the clock back by 20 years and, just look at the origin of how encryption and like the idea that encryption could be a global common sort of good, and there could be standards that could be deployed anywhere in the world and services that anyone could use in order to communicate with each other would have seemed quite preposterous, right? Like it was hard to export encryption out of the United States. Countries like were seemingly like restricting its use, and some of those laws still really exist. But I think the only reason we were able to overcome what at that time seemed like pretty wide and big barriers was this idea of solidarity, right? Like whether the solidarity was printing things on a t-shirt and taking them out of the country and that becoming speech, and therefore encryption like not being regulated the way it is, to the idea of like allyship and working with other communities who are impacted by encryption not being available to them, and making sure that like the technology exists at the scale that they can communicate with each other in as easy and as a secure manner as possible. So I think that in the many ways in which governments are looking at encryption, like one, like there are alternative like technical truths, there are like narratives being framed around like certain very heinous use cases that may seem to point towards why encryption should be broken. But I think that now more than ever, we need to maintain that sense of solidarity for why encryption is incredibly important and gives us, I think, the rights and the protections that it enables around the world, and to essentially hold the line.
Thank you, sir. Some last thoughts from Istvan and then Ed.
Thank you for everyone to share with this fascinating stories. This is actually give me power to go on. I mean, I'm coming from the engineers, a very rare type of engineers of cryptography engineering, and it's a lonely job because I need to explain to people what I'm doing, and little, very little amounts of people who understands why is it important, why is it relevant at all. And this helps me to move on, and this helps me to carry on creating new stuff, and this tells me, these stories tells me it's worth working on end-to-end encrypted services. And thank you for this. And what I want to just tell, I think it is also important these type of events, and when we're talking, to encourage other engineers, because in my experience that even in the engineering community, encryption is a mystery, hardly understood thing, and only a few can really build it. And this, when we're talking about these fascinating stories, can bring more talents, more brilliance on the engineering side to create even better products, which better tools to protect more information, more stories, more lives. Thank you.
Encryption is for Earthlings and not just the wizards. I love it. This is great. Mr. Snowden.
Thank you. Look, we've all said a lot. I think one of the noteworthy things here is there's not a lot of disagreement. And everywhere I've gone to speak in the last 8 years, universities, whether speaking to the student body, whether speaking in closed rooms to academic researchers, whether I'm speaking to civil society people, whether I'm speaking in private to members of government, right, parliamentarians, everybody understands the importance of this. Now, when we inject the political side and the security state into the conversation, only then does it begin to deviate, right? The engineers at companies, as we've seen here today, they understand the benefits of privacy. Anybody who grew up on the internet in the recent decades, they understand how many private things they've said online that they don't want to be judged by. That doesn't make them malicious, but when I was growing up, I made a lot of mistakes. I said stupid things. I had horrible beliefs that I was able to grow out of and abandon. But today we are made slaves to this permanent record that is compiled by third parties, by these intermediaries that we discussed before. And if we are going to have our lives cataloged and policed by these intermediaries that we are required to depend on, we must have some means to protect ourselves from them. Today, we are required to trust them. But in terms of security engineering, anyone will tell you, trust is a vulnerability. And we know, as people growing up in the current era, trust is consistently exploited by both corporate and political forces. And I just want to return to that idea, why does this matter? Why is privacy, the source of our power, so important in that social sense? Because it feels so abstract. You don't realize you need privacy until it's too late, until you need privacy right then. There's no time for a movement to achieve privacy, because you need the privacy to pull the lever that will improve the conditions of your life and the life of your society. Privacy is individual, but it is also collective, right? It is communal. Privacy cannot protect anyone in the same way that encryption cannot protect anyone unless they protect everyone. How, right? Well, what does privacy do? Privacy protects the minority. The people who are different, the people who are unusual, the people who are outside the norm. Why do we protect them? We protect them because they are the origin of progress. If we all had the same ideas, we're not going anywhere. We're going to live the same way we always have. But that difference, those differences can be threatening to many. Now, the people who developed our framework of thinking about the meaning of rights, they protect this privacy, they protect this minority for good reason, even though they are threatening, particularly to those who benefit from the status quo, particularly from those who are in positions of power today. Now, how does privacy protect them? Privacy protects that minority by making them indistinguishable from, and therefore equal to, the majority. You can't tell simply by looking at someone, their home, their car, the communications from their phone, whether they're a member of the minority or the majority, if we are doing it correctly. And why do I say it's communal? Well, if you normalize cooperation with intrusions into your privacy, if you say, I don't care about privacy because I have nothing to hide, well, you are then increasing the pressure on all of those people out there who are minorities. They could be racial minorities, sexual minorities, political minorities, minorities of thought and belief. But now you have exposed them because you have betrayed your obligation to a community right. Those rights, no rights, exist unless we protect them. And it is those of us who have the most influence and the most power in society who have to continue to uphold this shield. We've got to raise it up for those who are smaller and more different and more exposed and vulnerable if we want to have a free and open society, because free and open society arises from tolerance. And what is tolerance but a respect for difference? We protect that by protecting privacy, and we ensure privacy by guaranteeing encryption. Thanks for joining us on Global Encryption Day.
Thank you all for your time. Thank you for sharing your stories. Thank you for everything you've done in your teams. I'll end with this. About 3 years ago, I tweeted that if there were ever a time for there to be a nonprofit solely devoted to the cause of end-to-end encryption, it was then. I was wrong. And the reason I was wrong is exactly what Udbhav and other people are saying right now, is that the way that we will counter these threats, the way we will protect encryption and the ability to think freely, is through solidarity, is through this network, this tapestry of strong folks with just amazing experiences that are keeping them safe every day. Thank you all. We will close this press conference, and thanks everyone for joining.